Good morning and a warm welcome. Maybe we all get seated and could start in a few moments. Take your time. We still have the regular announcements to do. For a start, I'm Ralf Südhoff. I'm the director of the Center for Humanitarian Action, a think tank based in Berlin, and have the honor to facilitate this excellent panel. On the logistics, please feel free again to post about this on Twitter with hashtag you find, the slide will come up as well, HC Berlin. Please be reminded if helpful live captioning is provided and live translation in French and Spanish. And a new request, maybe it would be great if you could get out your mobiles because you might want to join us voting in a little survey we do in a minute, and you would need the QR code using for that. The session now this morning is about humanitarianism in the shadow of politics, navigating aid under pressure. And we really warmly welcome to this session with a very broad background of speakers and 5 speakers, so we need to be fast in everything we do. When you talk about prioritization, as this Congress does these days, you hardly cannot talk about politicization and about the potential prioritization along political lines and political interests. To shed some lights on this, one can look at this surely from various of angles, just mentioning quickly maybe 4. One, the major humanitarian crisis we face today themselves are very political ones: Ukraine, Sudan, Gaza, Yemen, Syria, and many of them due to the host governments of these very crises. Of course, there's the role of donor governments, where narratives in some contexts apparently change, and concerns of politizations rise, looking not only at the usual non-traditional donors and suspects like Russia, China, the Arabic states, but more discussion also about Western capitals in this regard. Brussels, the new setup of the new commission, a lot of discussion about this in Brussels, but also by change of government in Stockholm, in Den Haag, and maybe with new trends in Berlin, but we will discuss this today with Deike Potzel. Third, but also looking at aid agencies in this context, international and national ones, for one, struggling and feeling under pressure more and more if they need to recheck their apolitical approach in terms of neutrality and impartiality versus solidarity and political solidarity, for example, with colleagues in Ukraine, but also being actors themselves and not always aligned in should they accept maybe politicized funding, should they accept conditions to aid put on to them by host governments. And maybe sharing a final example from also yesterday morning, a more political approach coming from a very different angle as well. For example, on what we heard yesterday, like the question of humanitarian aid due to a political agenda, we would probably all subscribe humanitarian system change, if that might be a reason for not providing humanitarian aid in the foreseeable future, but to rather invest it into humanitarian advocacy, as Heba Ali shared yesterday morning, a call for rather prioritizing into advocacy and maybe on purpose finishing ineffective system from her point of view to make profound change inevitable. However, one might also take the view, well, politicization has been around forever. Humanitarian aid never has been in a bubble. It always has been naive to believe it's not political. It's always been driven by very political actors. So one might say this debate is just, well, old wine in new skins. We will discuss this as a kickoff on the panel, but that's also the question we would like to discuss with you. If you can take out your mobiles now and start your QR code and kindly vote with us, because we would like to put the question on you in the first place and get an impression if you think we are discussing for a start the right topic here, and ask you, do you think we see a new dimension of the politicization of humanitarian aid, or is that rather misleading? If we could change to them here you are, if you could quickly scan the QR code and while we are talking, vote on one of the potential responses, and afterwards our panel, you don't need to do it, Olivier, I will ask you in person, but you can, of course. If you can't read it, maybe, oh, but you are fast already. Answer one is yes, this is a strongly enforced trend. Second, yes, in some ways, there's a new dimension of politicization. Third, in some ways it is stronger, but in some ways it's also a weaker trend. Fourth, rather not, politicization is a long-standing feature, or no, not at all, the whole debate is just old wine in new skins. So maybe we give it a minute while you're voting, and then we would start discussing it with our panelists. And as it's a very complex issue, merging the debate about politicization, about principles, about prioritization, it's really complex, and let's see how far we can get it in the next 75 minutes or so. But it's also a reason why we would start looking at it from a very practical, very operational point of view. But first of all, let's see what has been your view. So we have a vast majority of 47% saying yes in some ways. It is definitely a new dimension. And if we merge the blue and the pink one, for now it's roughly 70% who see an impressive trend of new politicization. In which dimensions ever? That's of course an important issue to discuss. So many thanks for that feedback. So we might have an important topic to discuss, and you might stay if you agree, and then we would kick it off. So let's start looking into two crises which are much debated about politicization these days, and maybe kick it off with our guest from now Amman, based in Amman, but Wafa'a al-Saidy. Maybe we can kick it off with you. In a way, one might say your CV stands for such an experience and context of politicization, as you are from Yemen. You have been the head of mission of Médecins for Syria now, but you have been the head of mission in Iraq, in Pakistan, in Yemen itself. So you've got them all, one might say, and you must know it all. How would you have voted on the survey, and why?
Thank you very much. So for me, I think politicization of aid has been always there as a pressuring force on the humanitarian aid actors. And I would like to explain why it's there, and I don't believe it will go away. But what we can do about it, we will discuss that in the solution section. So for me, everybody as individuals or organizations, they work out of two settings of things. They do decisions and actions based on their values or interests, or both of them, individuals or organizations. For example, let's say as an individual, one of my highest values is to be honest. But then I go to the shop, I want to buy an umbrella in Berlin, and then I tell the seller, like, okay, it's with 7 euros. I found it in another shop with 5 euros. I'm not sure this will work in Berlin, however. I lied. It's a big, fat lie at that moment. So at that moment, I'm not acting based on my values. I act based on my interest, economical interests. And it's like this for every individual, for every organization. As humanitarian aid workers, we don't work in a vacuum. We work with donors, we work with recipients, governments, we work with communities, we work with suppliers, and all those actors, they do the same. They work based on their values and interests. We are the only ones that saying we will work as humanitarian aid workers and based on our values, and we have no interest. We are here to help the people in need. We have no political agendas, we have no interest, and we are the only actors who are claiming that. This is the promise we give to everybody. This is the words that we want to live up to them. However, this is not easy for everybody to accept, but that's why we are protected under the IHL. We have a special protection as humanitarian aid workers under the IHL because we have no interest. We work only based on the values. That's why we have a special status. We have exemptions from sanctions in the banks and everything. After that, the most visible politicization actors who are doing that are the recipients, government donors, but sometimes it's even the communities. We have been in Yemen, in Pakistan, in Syria, in Iraq. You have different actors pushing for interfering humanitarian aid workers, pushing to select suppliers. They're pushing to share beneficiaries list. Even the communities themselves, they push you. They said, okay, if you are going to serve this minority, we are not very much interested by you. If you are going to empower women in this community, we are not so much interested. And in some places, the NGOs have been kicked out of the area by the community because we are helping the vulnerable people and we are redistributing power, and that's inevitably a political impact that we are making. So we are not a political actors, but we need to accept that if we do our job well, we will empower vulnerable people that they don't have power, we redistribute the power, and that's by definition a political impact. Over from my side.
Many thanks for this frank view. So is it fair to say you are concerned in some ways, but not that much more than like a few years ago?
Yes, I think we need to focus on ourselves, how we respond to those political pressures, instead of saying, hey, it's new, we want everybody to stop being political. This will not get us anywhere. This is my point of view. Thank you.
Thank you. Marta. Marta Lorenzo, you are the representative probably of the hottest potato in this whole humanitarian debate for about a year. As your UNRWA representative for Europe, you're dealing with the Gaza crisis for sure on a daily basis. You've been based for years in Jerusalem yourself. You've been the Oxfam Regional Director for the MENA region. So you have all that background as well from the Middle East, with all these crises coming here into play. What's your take? How would you have voted on the survey?
Well, I would say that we are now in what I would call a perfect storm of a situation in which we see mounting needs, never-ending crises, many of them protracted. And at the same time, what we are seeing, or never before we have seen, a situation in which international humanitarian law, international law, and humanitarian actors have been disregarded the way we are disregarded today. So this is, I would say, from my point of view, because I am working on the Palestinian crisis, and specifically in Gaza, that we have never seen a situation in which so many humanitarian workers have been killed. We had Hugo speaking before about misinformation and disinformation, humanitarian actors on the ground being under attack. I could give a very good example of the polio vaccination campaign, in which was successful because we were able to negotiate access, which I think it is very important also to mention, because when there is political will, it is possible to deliver our work, but our work is becoming more difficult to deliver, and this is political. And yes, we delivered on the polio vaccination campaign, but then a few days after, those same vaccination centers were bombed and our staff killed. And in addition to our staff, there were also children killed. So we vaccinate them today, they get killed tomorrow. And of course, what we are seeing is an erosion of international humanitarian law, with the responsibility being put on implementing organizations on the ground to make it work. And yes, we can make it work to a certain extent, but of course, we also do need others to make it work. In the case of UNRWA, which is an organization funded through voluntary contributions, obviously, we would say we are a failure in the sense that we shouldn't exist by now. 75 years after 1948, we still exist delivering services for Palestinian refugees. So it should be about why are we not addressing the root causes? Why? And this is not just on Palestine. I have worked in the Sahrawi refugee camps 50 years after. We are not addressing the root causes of why people are in Algeria after 50 years, eating not fresh food, but dry food with very poor nutrition for issues that could be addressed easily if this political will would be there. Thank you.
And somebody wanted to clap. And following up on your take, so there is a strong politicization in the area of conflict you are dealing with. Would you see it also as a trend beyond what some might put as it's a special crisis, it's a special context? Is it a more international trend beyond Gaza?
I think Gaza is creating an exception in the system. That's how I very much see it. What it is not tolerated elsewhere is tolerated in Gaza. Why is it possible that we tolerate that 90% of the population is under evacuation orders that are never revoked? Why is it that we tolerate that there are these statistics that, and Hugo talked about the statistics, behind statistics there are numbers of 42,000 people killed, of humanitarian workers killed, of our own shelters. Just think that we had to transform our entire operation in the Gaza Strip, transforming our schools into shelters, and those same shelters get hit again and again. And unfortunately, they don't make it anymore to the news. 20 civilians killed in an UNRWA shelter under a UN flag, and unfortunately, they are not protected. So that says something about international humanitarian law, and that says something about whose responsibility it is to implement international humanitarian law.
Thank you so much. Let's move to somebody who has a very professional and a very personal background and experience in this context, Olivier Vandecasteele. You've been for 20 years engaged in very challenging and politicized contexts like Afghanistan and Mali for a start. You served as a country director for several NGOs. Before you've been detained yourself by political persecution in Iran and have been in prison for more than 15 months, which you allowed me to share, and which made you found right after the organization you're heading today, Protect Humanitarians, initiative advocating for better protection of humanitarian aid workers. Olivier, also in the light of your very broad experience, how do you see the trend? Is there a new dimension of politicization and lack of protection in your context, or how would you comment on that?
Thank you very much, and thanks for the invitation. So I think I would have voted as part of the 46%. That, of course, there's a certain degree of continuity. I would agree with Wafa'a on that, but I think more in line with Marta, I think what we see now is really a worsening trend, to say the least, with significant thresholds that have been crossed. Which brings back to the fact that I think there's a really urgent need for the humanitarian community to indeed better advocate together. Of course, to continue to focus on our mission and on our work, but also to push back on some of this politicization and instrumentalization by all sides, belligerent parties, but also donors alike. Also to jointly call for indeed better protection and care for humanitarian workers. And there, I would say in particular, with the localization agenda, the growing number, and actually the vast majority of the colleagues who are victim are national staff, but more and more also national leaders of civil society organizations and national NGOs leading humanitarian efforts, and we still see huge inequity when it comes to both how they are exposed, but how also they are resourced when it comes to staff care and protection. I see three worrying trends. Some have been touched upon, so I'll be a bit shorter than my notes, but I would say, number one, indeed, this consensus, which was never perfect, but there was a certain consensus around international law, and IHL is clearly eroding, crumbling, unraveling. Plenty of words have been used, but in short, I would say that IHL is really in the ICU right now, and I think there's a need to revitalize it. The second point is that I think no humanitarian colleague signs up to basically get shot, bombed, drone attacked, or kidnapped. So when we deliver assistance in challenging contexts, we do that from the point of view that we trust there will be respect for the rules-based order. We have confidence that the parties to the conflict will respect and protect humanitarian personnel. What we see now more and more is indeed that this is not the case at all anymore. And historically, just as a reminder, because a trend shift, we have not worn emblems and logos for branding. Actually, it was for both allow the population we serve to identify us and to approach us in trust, but also for the parties to the conflict to identify us for the intended objective of safety and security. Number two is that we are relied upon as a lifeline to a certain degree to deliver aid services, but we increasingly fall victim ourselves. I think this is very worrying. It was mentioned already. In my case, indeed, it was hostage taking and being used as a leverage to my home country. But what we see, indeed, is 595 colleagues last year in 2023, killed, wounded, kidnapped. We are well on track, I think, to match that number this year. I was looking at the data yesterday. We are already above 450, and we're only in October. And again, this huge discrepancy and this growing number. I mean, it used to be a few years ago 90% national staff. Now it's 95%. And what we see also is that the national NGOs and CSOs are also a growing percentage in this. So this risk transfer, this localization, which we all support, also has to be resourced when it comes to staff care and better support. My last point is where I see also clearly a threshold crossed, is that we see more and more this tension between our mandates, which indeed, as Wafa'a mentioned, is that humanitarian agencies operate on the principle that we work solely based on needs, and the donor community who increasingly take political decisions to align humanitarian assistance with foreign policy objectives. I think in quite a lot of contexts we can still, of course, work together, and that's very welcome. But what I think what we should worry about is that maybe in some contexts these objectives collide, and in some contexts, of course, we might see that some crises move from neglected to being forgotten. And I'll just close by mentioning again what I believe is an important document to quote here in this conversation, which is the European Consensus on Humanitarian Aid, which was drafted back in 2007, reaffirmed in 2017, and again in 2021, but which very clearly states the respect for independence means the autonomy of humanitarian objectives from political, economical, military, and other objectives, and to serve to ensure that the sole purpose of humanitarian aid remains to relieve and prevent the suffering of victims. This is not an NGO mandate. This was adopted by the European Council and all the member states, the European Commission, the European Parliament. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Olivier, and thanks for providing already quite different views on the topic in some ways. We are very happy to have Thea with us, Thea Hilhorst. You might bring in the longest institutional memory on these topics with you. You've been researching all these topics for rather decades than years, if I might say so, as a professor, and being with ISS, I always have to look up the long name Institute for Social Studies of Erasmus University in The Hague. Thea, how would you have voted on the survey, and what's your take if we see a new dimension of politicization?
I would go for the big change, so I would be blue. Not because I think there have not been politics before, but I just very much agree with Olivier that what we see today are very profound changes that are very difficult as well to roll back. And that is what is worrisome about it. And I will not repeat your points, Olivier. I could have made a few of them, just like you just did, and also Marta. But I wanted to perhaps add, before I move to another point, that where is this happening? We talk about our politicians, that they change things, you know, that they align this and that they are too political. But shouldn't we actually look into our societies too? Because that is where I see the support that was so natural for international humanitarian law, the support that was so natural for humanitarian assistance. In my society in the Netherlands, there has been doubts about development cooperation for some time, for all kinds of reasons, but the one thing that always stood out was humanitarian action as something that should be done and that was very important. I see that being eroded. So one of the things, unfortunately, that perhaps humanitarians have to add to their long list of things to do is not just knock on the door of your Ministry of Foreign Affairs, but actually see, back to square one, how to explain the importance of international humanitarian law to the people, to your neighbors, to everybody you know, to the societies we're from, because there it is eroding very deeply. That's where we see people voting now against all these things. And politics, honestly, it's no less or no more than a reflection of what is going on in society. We can talk about the role of disinformation and media and populism, I know, but nonetheless, the relation between politics and society is very strong. Second point. Can I make 2 points?
Yeah. Short 2.
I always tell my students they can only make 1 point in one intervention. I will make 2. I will go back to what you were saying about politics in the organizations and that humanitarians wouldn't have an interest. Well, they do. And I wanted to talk about politics, just go back to what is politics, very simple. I mean, for me, politics is everything that has to do with the production, allocation of ideas, resources, and people. Now, if you look at that, through that lens, you might see almost everything is political. And I think humanitarians may forget that they are political too. First, they are in a beautiful way political because you do the humanitarian politics. Some people may say humanitarian diplomacy. I would say humanitarian politics for international humanitarian law, and where, you know, the very idea of humanity is central to how you present yourselves to the world and the influence you seek to have. Very beautiful politics. There's other politics too in the humanitarian field, and that is, of course, the organizational politics, where naturally every organization, once it exists, it wants to keep existing, it wants to grow, it wants to maintain its staff. So there's, as a result, there's a lot of organizational politics and politicking of organizations that feel they're slightly better than the colleagues in the field. So there are many politics within the humanitarian action. And why I'm saying this is that we will come back to solutions. And probably the solutions are there too, where the humanitarians can do perhaps better politics. So we will get back to that later, but for now I just wanted to make that point that actually humanitarians are not only not interested, but they also are very political. Thanks.
Many thanks, Thea. So let's now turn to the donor side after having the operational background, the research background, etc. Deike Potzel, you are, and I'm sure in these times of multiple crises, nobody envies your portfolio you had already, because you're the Director General for Crisis Prevention, Stabilisation, Peace Building and Humanitarian Assistance at the German Foreign Office. And for almost a year, on top of that, you covered also a new job and post as a Commissioner for Humanitarian Diplomacy in the Middle East, if that's the correct title. And you had to travel very, very often to the region, as we all know. What's your take if you look at the donor landscape for a start? Is there a new trend of politicization, or what would be your comment?
Thank you so much. Just to go back out to the survey, I'd probably be on the lower bottom line, sort of the right. Of the answers, because I think Wafa'a very elaborately made clear like how broad the term actually is. What do we actually mean by politicization? I'm not really sure about that, and that's why I struggle with sort of the concept of it being bigger or more pronounced than we've seen in the past. We are, of course, taking political decisions. I mean, the first political decision is how much money do we have as a donor in a particular year? And you know that we are currently all, struggling to get more money for the next year. And that is a political decision. But does that mean this is being politicized? No. We have also mentioned humanitarian assistance, development cooperation in our national security strategy. But does that mean that we are politicizing? I wouldn't say so. But we explain how important this is, those means to support people in need worldwide and to help to prevent crisis, to stabilize regions, and so on and so forth. For us, I can say that we have put that in our just recently published humanitarian strategy, that we work on the basis of the humanitarian principles, and that to us is non-negotiable. But what we see worldwide is a shrinking humanitarian space. And this is extremely troubling, and we also see infringement of IHL, yes. It's, again, very troubling, and this is why we put a lot of effort these days also in humanitarian diplomacy, in advocacy. Yesterday, I also participated in a meeting of the Grand Bargain, where we all work together. And we also said we need more advocacy, jointly. We need to work together to improve the situation on the ground. So I think we have to be careful with that wording. We have to talk about specific incidents and specific contexts, and then really tailor our answers, be it diplomacy or be it actually the work on the ground, to the specific situation on the ground. The situation in Afghanistan with the Taliban infringing on women's rights, I mean, they did it under Taliban 1.0 already. But now we see sort of the same thing happening again, even worse now. So, of course, our context is changing, and we as humanitarians need to find ways to provide still for the people in need, and we need to adapt our answer. Same like the Houthis in Yemen, right? I mean, they are putting the humanitarian system under so much pressure, and that is, as Wafa'a said, of course they have political aims with that. They are following those. But we as humanitarians need to say we have our principles, and that of course might lead to answers that might look politicized, but really it is defending the spaces for humanitarians to work properly, to save humanitarian aid workers, to allow for them to work in a safe space. So I'll leave it at that for the moment.
Thank you so much. But let's maybe stay on a bit on the donor side. You've been the last one to get the mic, and maybe share also a bit of background for colleagues who might not all be totally familiar with humanitarian assistance. Maybe quickly sharing one slide you will like. Because we analyzed on the question of how principled and apolitical has been humanitarian assistance, for example, from Germany, but there's been a very similar perception from European humanitarian aid coming from Brussels. For example, we analyzed a while ago what have been the proportional needs in the global crisis set up if you account and add up the appeals, and what has been the proportional funding Germany donated to these crises. And as you can see, not in all of them, and of course not mathematically identical, but there was pretty much a match, one might say, and that led us to the analysis, some of you know, seeing Germany as a very principled donor, and that was also confirmed by international interviews we did with stakeholders, with the one exception that, of course, as many of you know, there has been pretty much over-proportional funding to Syria. The concern, I think, on money on the European level, where the new commission is set up, but also by some stakeholders following the German setup, is a bit, might this change because of this trend of politicization? Rather anecdotally sharing a bit what has been also in the mission letters and what has been leaked about documents being shared with the new commission in Brussels, but maybe just identifying one tweet from the upcoming designated commissioner for international partnerships. If we could move the slide to that one who framed when he's been designated, he will be a European commissioner with the aim of contributing as much as possible to Europe's economic development. And the International Partnership Department, as you might not know, is the former called Development One. It is on the Global South usually. The international partnership portfolio will allow me to focus on strengthening the EU's economic security, diversifying our suppliers of critical raw materials, and opening new markets for European companies. Looking maybe a bit more again on Germany very quickly, you mentioned it already, maybe you go to the next slide as well and skip that one. Was the launch of the new humanitarian strategy, and you mentioned already your challenges with the budget shrinking by 53%, and it's not finalized yet. Yes, the parliament might save the government, or however you would put it, but hopes are limited as far as we hear. But we are, of course, all with you and hope it will change. But the one way or the other, when the new humanitarian strategy of Germany was launched, there was, for one, a new narrative in it, to put it very strongly into a security context, while one might say, well, that's the narrative just for lobbying for principled aid. Having said that, as of course you will know, State Secretary Baumann at the launch said the budget is shrinking while humanitarian needs are growing. Therefore, we have to set priorities, which means we must focus on crises that have an impact on Europe. And in more concrete terms, it had been announced even before to withdraw more or less, if that's correct, from Latin America, to decrease engagement in Asia, etc. So how would that play out from your view? You mentioned that definitely politicization in the operational context in the host governments, but how would you comment on what's the development, for example, on the Berlin level?
Yeah, thank you so much. And first of all, a quick note on the first chart, because that I assume it's Germany's sort of bilateral support, but I just want to also underline that, I mean, every fourth euro from the European Union is actually German money, and that we are also very present in a lot of these contexts through CERF, for instance, or to country-based pooled funds. So it's a bit difficult to say where we are not, because we are actually everywhere with our money. And that speaks to the fact that we are really working, as I said, on needs-based approach, and that we are really adhering to the principles. Now, with regard to this quote, if you have less money, you have to make decisions. So, and then, of course, you look also at other contexts and where other donors, I mean, we are not working in a vacuum, where other donors could be engaged and are engaged. And then we have to see where do we have an impact with our money, where don't we have an impact. And like, for instance, with regards to Asia, I very strongly feel that other Asian countries could step up in their support for humanitarian assistance. And we are talking to our Asian colleagues. We also have an agreement within the EU to reach out to non-traditional donors, as they are called, to bring them into the picture. We are also very strongly talking to our, very intensively talking to our colleagues in the Gulf countries. So I just was about, or I am about to go to Riyadh again, to Jeddah again, to talk about those issues. And we are in constant contact also with the UAE, with Qatar, and so on and so forth. And like the Saudis, they have really stepped up. Also, the UAE is very engaged, not only in Gaza, but in other contexts. Qatar is very engaged. So same holds true for, of course, America, Latin America, and so on and so forth. So we need everybody on board. And I think it's not, I mean, we should not be reproached for investing a lot of money in Ukraine, which is, of course, you know, it's so close to us and we have a responsibility there. But we are also, as this chart very nicely showed, I think, very engaged in all the regions, particularly, of course, in the MENA region, in Africa, where needs are exploding, and we will continue to do so.
Maybe just following up on that very concrete question, because of course that's a line of argument coming from other donors as well, and a bit putting it in a way like needs are needs, and why shouldn't we invest in the needs close by, proximity, etc., while other people might suffer as well, but if we align our interests to the needs of some people, isn't there a major risk that we talked for decades about forgotten crisis? If division of labor between donors would be so good, would have never been forgotten crisis. What makes you hope, when I dealt with the Syria crisis 10 years ago, there was already a lot of talk about getting the Arab states on board. We talk about China, Russia. Isn't there a major risk that crisis context in Asia, nobody will take care of it? If South Sudan is not of geopolitical interest, nobody will take care of it. If Venezuela, Trump administration doesn't care about, nobody will take care of it. And isn't then a needs-based approach a different one than setting we prioritize European contexts?
Well, I didn't say that we should leave the one or only do the other. As you nicely showed, you know, we are still engaged everywhere.
But that was the past.
But Well, no, it's also the future, right? But yes, I mean, we need to bring in others, right? I mean, the Americans, they are a huge donor. They are also everywhere. And we will sort of stay engaged. I mean, we are still one of the biggest donors worldwide. We are engaged also, and we continue to be engaged in Afghanistan, of course, and we have been instrumental, I feel, also with regards to, for instance, the Rohingya response, continue to stay engaged also with regards to Bangladesh and so on and so forth. So it's not that we are retracting from crises. And again, you know, I mean, we are one of the biggest supporters for SAF, one of the biggest supporters for country-based pooled funds. We are very engaged in flexible funding, for instance, which, you know, a lot of people feel we need more also from other donors. So I don't think that we are retracting, but yes, if you have less money, you know, you have to make a decision in the end. But then on the other hand, I mean, even if the budget was to end up where the proposal is now, we also have a little note in there saying that in case of an emergency situation, we may knock on the finance ministry's doors to ask for additional money, and that speaks to, again, you know, the needs-based approach. If there was a need, we still have the possibility to get engaged. And honestly speaking, now with Lebanon, there is, you know, our fingers are already scratching at the door of the finance ministry now. So we will keep engaged wherever the needs are.
Thank you for now. Marta, if I might turn another question to you. I mean, if this take, there is politicization, but rather on the operational host government IHL side, but not so much in the donor landscape overall. Is that what you could subscribe? Is there a new trend, or would you say no, it's...
Definitely for UNRWA there is a new trend that is unprecedented. We have seen for the first time not just detractors of the organization, but unprecedented demarches as the one that is taking place right now at the Knesset, trying to or calling for the dismantling of the agency. This is new. And I think it is new, and it has several implications, politically, legally, and operationally. If UNRWA is to go away, not just from the Gaza Strip, but also from the West Bank, it will mean that there will be many, many people whose needs will not be addressed without a clear alternative of who would be taking over. Politically, it would mean that this will happen in the absence of political negotiations between the two parties. And legally, eventually what it means is that it goes against the UN Charter, it goes against the General Assembly. Our mandate comes from the General Assembly. Therefore, if our mandate is to be changed, that should be discussed at the General Assembly. I think you have seen many different resolutions from the UN Security Council. You have seen it also from the rulings, the provisional measures of the ICJ, and others, calling for sustained assistance in Gaza, which if we were to go away today, knowing that we represent between 50 to 60% of the humanitarian operations, the humanitarian operations in Gaza will collapse. Can we afford this right now? The answer is no. But if we look even beyond, if we look a little bit into the future, in a context in which we have seen a lot of polarization in both Israeli and Palestinian societies, in which we will have to restore public services, and it is very, very unclear what governance is going to look like in the Gaza Strip. Therefore, we need to strengthen humanitarian actors, not just UNRWA, but those humanitarian actors that are on the ground, to be able to bring back to school about 650,000 children that are traumatized. And it's not just children, it's teachers, it's parents, it's absolutely everybody. And perhaps reconstruction is a big word, and it looks like very, very expensive. But from my experience of having lived in the Middle East for almost 30 years, what it is much more difficult to restore is trust among societies. And we cannot restore trust if we keep a full generation of children out of school. So I think that is very, very important. And maybe one more point, if you allow me, because we have seen a lot of misinformation and disinformation and an extremely harsh campaign against UNRWA, but also other UN agencies and humanitarian actors. Many of the NGOs that are sitting in this room, probably they don't have visas to operate in Palestine. These are operational constraints. If we do not have the minimum conditions or the minimum requirements to operate, how are we going to ensure that we can address people's needs?
Thank you, Marta. Thea, maybe turning to you again on the question how to judge fairly on the donor landscape. Do you see a politicization of top donors and talking rather about the more traditional ones, or is it more of the same we've seen in the past anyway?
Oh, no. Thanks for your question. Do you mind if I just go back to the question of what is politicization, which you asked? Because I think it's true, we have to be very precise about this. Now, there are very many instances of politicization. I will not give you the full lecture, but two types of politicization is first to make humanitarian assistance instrumental, meaning that you actually give humanitarian assistance, but you actually do it for other objectives. Now, I only need to use the word migration, and I think we all know what we mean. Second, when you use humanitarian assistance in a selective way, and that is relating as well to the international humanitarian law. So if you're selective, so you defend IHL in one place but not in another, that is the politicization of humanitarian action. And that is what we see happening at this moment very badly. And I totally concur with you. It is a bit unprecedented, because what is happening to UNRWA should actually mobilize every single donor in the world, because an attack on UNRWA is an attack on the UN, it's an attack on the world order, it's an attack on all of us. And it's not staying with UNRWA. Guterres is now an unwanted person too. Now, so we do need to really step up this type, and I don't see it happening. I'm very disappointed. Now, what is political and not among the donors? And that is one qualification to make too. It's also about coherence. So I really pity the people who work for the donor in the Netherlands. You know, our Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the people who are working there are quite a few of them who step out of the building every week to protest their own government. That's also unprecedented. These are people working for the government, stepping out to protest the government. Why? Because they feel that the government is actually acting against our grondwet. What's the grondwet? Constitution. So that's why they feel that as civil servants, they have to step out. So it's also about those people who are actually working for humanitarian action in the ministries. They want to do the job. They understand principles. But how do they advance their influence over those other politics that are there, that are their governments, etc., etc.? So that is often, of course, where the problem is. And there we see big changes, where indeed the space is a bit shrinking for those good, willing civil servants in the ministries to maintain the humanitarian. But it's something we all have to step up, and politicization is there, unfortunately, and it's very strong, I must say.
Before coming to you, Olivier, in a minute, if I may, Wafa'a, can I turn tables a bit? One might argue, taking the big picture of Thea, and say, well, isn't politicization also on the donor side always a bad thing? Syria crisis might serve, especially in the German context, as a prime example. 10 years ago, Germany has been a humanitarian dwarf, providing hardly any funding while being a top donor on the development side. But then Syrian migration to Germany made, including the Conservative Party, really step up, provide, of course, in this context then, from their perspective, coming from the parliament, very earmarked funding for Syria crisis. And that being the cornerstone of building Germany as a top donor, but using it in a very politicized context and arguing very much in the migration context. And the Syria crisis, you are in charge of, is benefiting from it until today in a way, funding-wise. So is it just to be about more pragmatic and to play the game, or do you see also a risk in this process, or is it maybe overplayed in due course?
So again, for me, we need to accept that different actors in the humanitarian arena will be pushed by different motives to support this crisis, but not this one, but this one. And I think we should accept that. We should accept they will be pushed by their own motives. What we should not accept is to say humanitarians, organizations and individuals are also politicized, and we should accept this as a fact. For me, this is very dangerous. For me, we can go with the donors, with the actors. And sorry if you feel very much offended by this example, but it's the same way in armed conflict. We negotiate with the armed groups to have access, no? We sat with them on the table, and sometimes they take a picture in, I don't know, Sana'a North, and then the picture is on the newspaper to see, the head of the mission of this organization is sitting with this rebel group, and the people on the other side are saying, you are giving international recognition to this armed group. For us, we are humanitarian workers. We focus on the principles, we focus how to provide assistance. So for me, it's up to the donor themselves to judge themselves whether they are acting according to their interests or humanitarian principles. If we come align in one crisis that they're willing to give more money without interfering our work, that's the point, because some donors, they give some money, but they want to dictate what are the programs they are supporting. We tell them, for example, some donors, they say, okay, in this region, we support only family planning, while we are telling them as a medical organization, but you need other primary health care package, you need consultations, the population needs this and this and that, and they said, no, sorry, it's not with our strategy. This should not be accepted. On the other hand, I think what we need to defend is what you have mentioned, the humanitarian space. It is the space that we accept all actors to donate, to interact, to work with, as long as they respect our humanitarian principles and professionalism. I am sorry to give you another silly example today. Imagine a situation, you have a block in the sink in the kitchen, you try to fix it, it's not working, you bring a plumber, and then you are on the neck of this plumber, no, you do this, you do that, no, at one point, the guy will tell you, give me a break, give me a space. Go smoke cigarette, but let me do my job. I am the professional here, no? You have been in those situations. All what we are saying as a humanitarian, give us humanitarian space to do our job. We can uphold and implement humanitarian principles, but don't interfere in our job. You give us the money, we know you have your interests, but don't put your agenda on my humanitarian space, and then I can work. It's the same message we give to the countries that they start to say, we don't allow women to move without a company. We start to say, okay, we need to have access to this population. And as a humanitarian actors, for me, it's the humanitarian space that we want to work in, rather than to deny that the others will have political interests. They will always have a political interest. They will make their decisions based on prioritization, their strategic priorities. It is really risky when we become the same. As you mentioned, Thea, it's true that sometimes we have our own growth, we have our own targets to expand, to be in this emergency, to put our flags there. For me, this is happening, but it shouldn't be acceptable. What we should accept is that our actions will have a political impact, will impact the population politically wise. We will redistribute power. This is inevitable. If we do our job correctly, this will happen for the most vulnerable people, and some people will be angry. But we should not accept that we become obsessed about our own interests, our own growth values, our own willingness to have an identity, a brand, this, and we pretend it's in the favor of the people we concern. This is very risky. It's happening. We should not accept it. Same way that the corruption happens in the humanitarian arena, but it's not acceptable. The exploitation of aid is happening by some aid workers. We should not accept that. We are fighting against that. We should fight against putting our interest higher than our values as humanitarian aid workers at organizational level as well. Thank you.
Many thanks, Wafa'a. And just following up on the point quickly on micromanagement of bureaucracy, etc., would you see the trend there? Because there are concerns that top donors, not that much Germany, just the opposite, but UK, ECHO are far more micromanaging again, averse to what they committed to in the Grand Bargain. Is this an issue also of politicizing because they want to make sure what the funds are used in the way they, for political reasons, look at? Is that a politicization trend from you as well, or is it in parallel? If you feel free to comment.
You mean if we accept this or we evaluate this action as politicization of aid? For me, it becomes a politicization of aid if the donor is telling us, in the same country, you are telling me the needs are here and there and there, and I tell you, no, you go only to this corner. It's not up to you to prioritize according to the needs. It's our job to tell you those are the priority needs, those are the most vulnerable population. If you have $1 million, you give it to the humanitarian response, we decide who gets the money based on the vulnerabilities, based on the needs. It's not based on your political agenda. So I think we evaluate case by case whether this is politicization or not of aid. But yes, it happens in the past. It happens as well from the local authorities that they tell us, you support this group, but not this minority group. And we pushed against that. We tell them we target people based on their needs, not based on your political agenda. So yes, they might have their political agenda. For me, it's fine. But they should not interfere our job. Let us do our job the way we think it's principled.
So have an agenda, but leave us alone with it. That would be your approach. Olivier, of course, we always like to talk about the donors when we talk about politicization, but aren't there other actors in the play as well? For example, aid organizations have to deal, of course, with political motivated funding. They have to deal with donors who might be a conflict party but fund humanitarian aid for various reasons, etc. And at some point you said, for example, regarding IHL, well, it might be also to civil society to decide if in the past we needed to defend IHL, but in future it might be a way if we don't coordinate, if we don't join forces, etc. Do you see there a lack also in dealing with these challenges and these issues, and there is homework to do also for UN agencies, civil society, etc.?
Yes, 3 times yes. So I think it's what we call a shared responsibility. It sounds nice, but I think so. It means that basically on all levels, the donor community, but also the humanitarian responders community, I think we have work to do when it comes to indeed better defending the principles. Of course, also training our staff so that the principles are actually lived for in the field. But maybe I'll just give a few of the latest. It's a non-exhaustive list of incidents that were recorded just in the past weeks, in the past 30 days. And my point will be that basically we see this in all contexts. So some contexts are more mediated than others, but I think what we see globally, again, if we look at the humanitarian community, is that for an NGO, an incident or an attack on an aid worker or an infrastructure that is being targeted might be still rather exceptional. But if we look at the community of humanitarian responders, it's just very, very normal, common now. And so what we are trying to indeed push for with Protect Humanitarians, specifically on that topic of better protection and better also care for our staff and our colleagues in the field, it's basically that we have common challenges to address. So why do we keep as agencies to deal with these issues still too much in silos? It does not mean that each incident, that everyone needs to get involved in each incident. Incidents will still be managed individually by organizations because there are legal ramifications, etc. But when it comes to the prevention and when it comes to the, what we can improve to better support and care for staff, in particular exposed to regular violence, we can learn from each other. And that space is currently non-existent. Just to say also, other sectors because it might sound a bit, idealistic to say we should work on that. Other sectors have performed quite better than the humanitarian sector on that. Journalists and reporters have created coalitions who stand for all journalists and reporters, no matter who they are, even freelance journalists who are not involved with big media, so that they have access to resources, to measures that can protect them, that can eventually get financial support when they've been, I don't know, wounded, when they need mental health care. As a sector, to me, there's a big dissonance between sometimes the mission we portray and sometimes our own internal practices. And I think there we have huge opportunity to grow in terms of fairness and equity. And I say that between 4 international organizations, between international staff and national staff, but also how we partner with national civil society organizations, how we partner with national NGOs, how we actually really support local actors to take the lead, but also to better protect and care for their own staff. Quite often these budgets are still somehow lost in translation between the donor and the local volunteer group. It's very unfortunate, because what we see in all contexts is that it is the smallest organizations who are to a certain degree the most exposed and the less resourced. So there is a fundamental problem there that we need to, I think, address, and that is to be coherent with our messaging. And I think it's a huge opportunity to grow and show that we actually stand by our values.
Thank you so much for these frank views. I would love to move on to the audience, because I'm sure there are a couple of first hands rising already. Unless somebody of you right now has an urgent comment. No, you grab your pen. Okay. Very good. I think it's good that you get prepared, Frau Potzel. So let's move to the audience in the room in the first place, and then see if there is anything online. And we can start right here, please.
Hello, my name is Mustafa Kamala. I'm a medical doctor coming from the Kurdistan region of Iraq, and I study Masters of Public Health here in Hamburg. So humanitarians are not only disregarded, but they are also targeted. And yesterday in one of the sessions, we talked about healthcare workers and the fire, and they are not collateral damage anymore, but they are attacked as a part of war strategy. So, and we have seen that the international humanitarian laws have not been effective in protecting them and decreasing the trust of humanitarian workers of being protected. And it's difficult to currently find alternatives to protect these people. But I'm glad that we have the Ambassador Potzel here from the German Federal Foreign Office. And I would like to raise a question is, how is Germany's foreign diplomacy in negotiating or implementing consequences of breaking the IHL, because the level of politics that's required to protect the IHL is from a country level, because the parties involved in breaking these laws already don't care about the humanity or the humanitarian organizations. And and I'm trying to be very politically correct here, but I hope you understood my question, and I would be very happy to see your thoughts. Thank you.
Would you like to answer directly? Maybe that's... Yeah. Anybody something related, because we wouldn't need to mix it too much from my view. Something related to IHL, how to engage in humanitarian diplomacy, Germany's role in it. Yeah, there.
Already have it. Hello, my name is Imam Daoud. I'm a health advisor at MGM Germany, Erste Welt. I voted yes at the beginning, and I would like to ask if we could ask for more political intervention in the humanitarian aid. Not on the side of the top-down written strategies, but on the side of really supporting the operations in the field. And a simple example right now is countries that are sending weapons to war areas. If they do not want to stop sending weapons, at least they could have some conditions with sending those weapons to guarantee protection of humanitarian workers, to approve the access to humanitarian aid and safe areas. How can we ask for this support?
Thank you so much. I think we leave it with the 2 questions for now. Would you already jump on it?
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much for those questions. On our humanitarian diplomacy, maybe I work with 2 examples. First of all, like with regards to the Middle East, with regards to Gaza, our minister has been in the region 11 times now since the war broke out. I've been traveling in my role as special envoy for the region at least 16 times. So it's been a busy year of traveling. And during those trips, we have been talking to all the relevant actors, pushing on IHL, pushing on access, pushing on improving the humanitarian situation. Now, you know that also the Americans are very invested in this. I have a British colleague, a special envoy. I mean, basically the entire, a big chunk of the international community is very invested, and we are not happy with the results of our engagement because the situation remains so dire and it's gotten worse, right, in the Middle East. But we keep pushing and we keep trying. Another example would be Sudan, where we are also very much invested in diplomacy. And there are so many others where we are trying on the political level to have an impact. At the same time, supporting humanitarian actors, not only by providing money, but to take on board, and I've done that really extensively over the last year, to take on board the issues of the humanitarians, to then talk to the relevant authorities to say, you need to do this and this and that. And we do that, as I say, in a number of crises worldwide. But we are also, on the other hand, for instance, supporting ICRC, who are also instrumental in protecting IHL and advocating for it. But, and I'm coming back to your comment there, Wafa'a, I wasn't actually, feeling offended or something, because we also support, we are one of the big donors for Geneva Call, who are actually, reaching out to exactly those groups to teach them about IHL, to make sure that spaces are growing. We are supporting CCHN, don't know who is familiar with them, they are, they have created a huge network of humanitarian workers, aid workers, that they train for those negotiations at the front line. And that is something that we have been supporting for years now, and we will continue to do so. So then on the second one, I think a bit of my answers already sort of targeted at that, or was targeted, the support for the operations in the field. We do that very intensively. One example, for instance, is now indeed Yemen, Houthi territories. I mean, we have been, reaching out and conveying our concerns. And also asking them to allow for bigger space and so on and so forth. We are very strongly coming out against the detention of humanitarian aid workers, which have happened over the last months, and so on and so forth. Just one last sentence on the weapons. I think that's important. I don't want to evade the question. I'm sure you all know that we have a very close sort of weapons export regime, which we are following very, very closely, and it's a case-by-case decision. So I don't want to talk about others, but let me also assure you that if we know about arms exports to conflict settings, I'm just saying, like an example, Sudan, we are talking to the relevant actors about those issues and making clear what our expectations are. I'll leave it at that.
I mean, maybe as a little follow-up question, linking the two. What's that? Oh, sorry.
I just want, if I can, it's just to kind of add to the conversation on IHL. I think because sometimes I think we hear in the sector this tendency to question IHL. And I think it's important to state, at least in my point of view, that it's not that international humanitarian law fails. It's basically the will to enforce international humanitarian law that is currently lacking. Because, and I think that that's really important. A second point is that I would say currently we've been very much focused on indeed engaging, with parties to conflict on, awareness raising, training for staff, etc. There's been already quite a lot, and I think it needs to be indeed continued. But I would really nudge there in saying, like, can we not do more than this? Because I think there's this huge blind spot, which is impunity. Which is, yes, we can, organize more training sessions for our staff, more training sessions for armed groups, etc. The big question is, like, if we look again just at last month, we've had UN staff killed in Lebanon. We've had national staff killed clearly by armed actors, RSF in South Sudan. We've had, as you mentioned, we have now for over 3 months a lot of humanitarian colleagues arbitrarily detained by the Houthis. We've had just in recent days more aid workers attacked and injured. And the question is always, okay, so basically nothing happens to any of this. We've had also Red Crescent volunteers who were targeted by drones in Russia in the last month. So the question is, like, is there a will for states to actually give teeth to IHL, which basically means supporting legal cases? I'm not saying it will be possible for all cases, but when there are very clear, documented cases of violations of IHL, there needs to be a consequence. And currently, we don't see that happen. We understand that humanitarian aid is very short-term, etc. International justice is very long-term, different types of actors, but I think that bridge needs to be made, because otherwise we will continue in the next 5-10 years to say that we should have more IHL and more respect for IHL, but nothing will have changed.
Many thanks, Olivier, and maybe some of you are happy to comment later. It's a bit also on the point, if I got it right, if we need a politicization of aid in contextualizing it, in the sense that if you don't have the sanction regimes, might you need hard policy factors like banning arms sales to governments, etc., who don't accept humanitarian efforts and diplomacy, and where it doesn't fly, which is probably the argument if you need more coherence on the foreign policy side of the European Union, for example. Let's continue with questions from the audience, and happy, of course, now to merge, to walk away from this one. I can hardly see it back there. Yes, please. And then
hello, thank you everyone for sharing your insights and experiences. My question is related to the decision of Germans, reduction of humanitarian funding, because it would indeed have impact on delivery of agencies on the ground to deliver. And speaking from experience, reduction of fundings and immediate phase-outs could have very negative impacts, and sometimes it could somehow hinder achievement of initially intended objectives. I would like to ask if there has been any exit strategy incorporated into the decision-making process, and if you can elaborate a bit more on that. Thanks.
And the question here in the first row, if we could have a mic. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Andreas Wolf from Medico International. I have one question also related a little bit, like looking at the broader picture of this politicization issue. And is it not, and can we really speak about these terrible attacks on the international humanitarian law and the physical attacks on the health workers without speaking about what happened with this war on terror policies that have seen not only in the case of the Middle East but also in Sri Lanka in 2009, when the justification of killings of civilians, of also aid workers, and the deliberately targeting also of humanitarian actors and hospitals is a deliberate policy in these supposedly war against terror. And the problem of politics and also the states who are regarding conflict parties basically as terror organizations, of course, is delegitimizing the whole setup of international humanitarian law. Is this not a problem that you see, or how you would respond to this question, if this is a basic problem in these last 15, 20 years? Thank you.
Maybe one more here to the right side, and then we...
Hello, I'm Caroline from the Network on Humanitarian Action, NOHA. Actually, my question is split into two different points as well. The first one would be regarding the question of funding shortfalls and acts, and these being seen as political excuses and justifications also to not engage in less convenient crises. This is, on one hand, weaponizing the needs and picturing this within the framework of not having funding to escape addressing the specific impact. So I would like to ask if this is not politicized, or is just seen as a political question but not politicized, as Ambassador has mentioned, how do you measure the impact of this choice, since cutting funding will essentially undermine all of the projects and responses in practice on the ground? And the second question goes back to the quotation that was mentioned, and also that Ambassador and Director for UNRWA mentioned, about focusing only on crises that are mostly have an impact on Europe. But then I switch the question in the quote and think, but Europe has an impact on all of these crises as well. So how can we phrase these statements and interventions in a way that it actually hides the responsibility that European states, including Germany, have had and still have on this crisis? And I would like to ask, in this specific framework, how do we strike a balance between what is the military spending and supporting states which are actually aggressors in some cases, and still, on the other hand, giving humanitarian aid to the affected by the aggressors? Are we playing the same? Are we playing the two sides of the coin? Are we doing the bad guy, good guy game? Is this a performance? And how can we do that, anticipating the problems of the future? Because more will come. It will come with the climate change, with the climate crisis, with gender justice. So I would like to ask specifically to the Ambassador, how do you anticipate a sort of a solutions for these kind of responsibility and accountability issues, given that we do not have an international enforcing mechanism still for IHL?
Thank you. Maybe one final question here in the second row.
Thank you. Thanks very much for the great panel. My name is Anita from NIR. I have a question for Wafa'a. I was really impressed with your points, but I wanted to ask and also maybe challenge you to break down a bit your points around taking a pragmatic approach, or really focusing on our work. What do you think the trade-offs are, and specifically as it relates to justice? As we see in Palestine, I have colleagues that say, leave your food, give me my vote at the UN Security Council, as we heard Haba say yesterday. So do you see that if there are trade-offs in taking the approach that you're suggesting, specifically for justice?
Thank you. Maybe we start not with Frau Potzel, as you will have the series of points. Marta, on the issue of war of terror, and what does that mean for this whole polarization debate and, for example, your work. I'm sure you want to comment.
Well, anything in Gaza now could be legitimized through the war on terror. But I spoke yesterday, before, on 90% of the people being squeezed on 10% of the territory in Gaza. So if these people are squeezed in our shelters and our shelters are targeted, is that a legitimate target? I would say no. And I would question what is proportional, because one of the issues on international humanitarian law is about proportionality. And I think we are negotiating what proportionality means. And when 20 people get killed in a shelter, and these 20 people happen to be women and children, that seems to be acceptable. And I would say that we are now confronted with accepting the unacceptable. Accepting that people starve, accepting that people are denied access to health centers, accepting that our own staff are being killed, and 2 days after they are being called a legitimate target because they were terrorists. And that has happened to UNRWA again and again. And it's only recently that in that center that I mentioned, on the polio vaccination center, 6 of our staffs were killed, and 2 days after, or 1 day after, we got the news that 3 of them were labeled as terrorists, when we had no evidence whatsoever from Israel that this was the case. So I think that is very difficult in a context in which there is not any more law and order. UN organizations and humanitarian organizations on the ground, they do not work with armed escorts. They don't have any kind of protection. We have to rely on the protection being by the host country or in the protection coming from the international community. When this protection is not there, it's also very difficult for us to protect our own premises. And in the case of UNRWA, many of our premises were abandoned because we have no choice, and we were affected by the same evacuation orders as everybody else. And therefore, what happened to these premises and how these premises were used by armed groups, whether Hamas or any other armed groups, including the Israeli Defense Forces, we simply do not know. And picking up on what it was said before by Olivier, I think it is not the international humanitarian law or the humanitarian action framework failing. It is its implementation. And it is not the absence of instruments. The instruments are there, but they are simply not being used. Thank you.
Thank you, Marta. Wafa'a, the question for you on what's the risk of being pragmatic, and isn't there a trade-off?
So for me, it's not a pragmatic in the sense that we are telling the donor, you just give us the money and the space and we will do the job, we and the national actors. I'm trying to be practical rather than theoretical to see what we can do at our end to improve the things. Because as my colleague was mentioning yesterday, it's easy and cheap to criticize the UN, for example. Of course, it's expensive to criticize the donors, but what I'm saying is that we can do better as humanitarian aid workers, including the advocacy. Humam, you call it political aid. Yes, we need a political aid. But how we translate the facts that we are getting from the field into evidence-based advocacy messages that will shake the table and will make changes. This, we need to do better. We need to do better advocacy. And unlike some messages that I keep hearing, a humanitarian aid worker, maybe you should do less service delivery for the needy people and you need to do more political activities. I think we need to do more service delivery, more political advocacy. They're both going hand in hand. And if we want to address the root causes of the human suffering around the world, we cannot do just service delivery. It's just we need to do better in the political advocacy as well. What we need to do better at our side is to build on integrations and to build on different capacities. You mentioned, thank you, the example of Geneva call. Sometimes the resources are there, but we are too busy, too much working in silos that we don't build on those strengths and capacities. Let's take the example of the crisis action. They're very much specialized in advocacy. In many cases, they come to us saying, okay, what are your advocacy messages? And we just fail to feed them with meaningful data that will be published anonymously, and it will be strong in front of political leaders because we do our works in silos. So I am saying Yes, we can complain all the time about politicization of aid. It will not stop it. What we need to stop is to be political actors in the motives of our decisions. Thus, we have to fight against. We need to be better in service delivery, better in our accountabilities, better in advocacy. And we need to do a lot of political advocacy as well with other actors. Thank you.
Many thanks, Wafa'a. Maybe quickly trying to summarize the question headed to Frau Potzel, directed to Frau Potzel. To two, if that's fair, I mean, one on how can we justify to make the link between Europe and humanitarian crisis in other contexts by asking what is the impact on us versus what's our responsibility for them. And in these, surely related, of course, to feeding into one or the other conflict and, of course, on the climate change side. And the second one, funding shortfalls as an excuse for politicizing and prioritizing in a more political way, using very often the example of Ukraine crisis being comparatively far overfunded to other ones. Why not deprioritize then Ukraine and go for another one, a forgotten one?
Thank you so much. And there was the question about the exit strategy for the funding, the reduction of the funding. So on the reduction of the funding, we are basically, if the currently discussed proposal is adopted, and as I say, we hope that it might evolve a little bit, but if it was adopted, it basically means that we are going back to the level of 2019, i.e., or the then projected proposal as of 2019. Meaning, in between, we got extra money for Ukraine and we got extra money for the COVID response. So we are going back, but we are going back to sort of before the two other big crises. We will, as I said before, continue to be engaged, led by the humanitarian principles and led by the needs. It's a needs-based approach, and we will also still remain present in a huge number of crises around the world. And by the way, Germany has been on the forefront, I'd say, in pushing against forgotten crises. We have always made those points, and we are engaged also in forgotten crises heavily. The exit strategy, and I want to allude to our humanitarian strategy again, where we talk extensively about efficiency and effectiveness of the humanitarian system. We are still a very strong supporter of a concept that makes people laugh, and that's the nexus. I don't laugh about it. I think if done correctly, this can really make a huge difference if humanitarians, development actors, and peace actors are in a process right from the start, in a crisis, in a context right from the start. If they come up with joint responses, we would really make a big difference on the ground. And this is not happening to the extent that's necessary. We are setting up a new funding tool, the Nexus Funding Facility in the Lake Chad region, where we will only provide funding, and this is then indeed a conditionality, if we get joint project plans from the different actors, jointly. Because we need to push the system, and this is what we are trying to do. Second example, we are one of the biggest donors for anticipatory action and also one of the biggest advocates for anticipatory action. We have spent over the last 2 years 5% of our humanitarian budget for anticipatory action. And we will continue to do so because every dollar or euro spent on anticipatory action will save at least 7, some say 16, some say even more in terms of crisis response money. So that is, again, for us, sort of part of what you call an exit strategy, what we call improving the humanitarian system, improving the humanitarian response. And you just mentioned also, Wafa'a, data. We are also big in supporting the CRAFT mechanism. For instance, we are supporting the IOM Data Institute here in Berlin. We are we have our own data sort of unit in the ministry in order to provide better data also on, for instance, climate crisis and fragility, vulnerability indexes and things like that. So we are really trying to help the system get better, get more focused, get more efficient, and get more effective. And we invite everybody to take part in that. Second question, hide the responsibility on Europe. Look, I mean, as I said before, we need to bring in other actors, other donors into the picture. It is impossible and it's unsustainable that the three biggest donors account for 60% of all the humanitarian budget spent. It's simply not sustainable. So others need to step up, and this is what we are pushing internationally. And we are also reaching out to private donors, to IFIs, to DFIs. We are also setting up, together with the UN, a new tool, which we call an innovative financing tool, Investing for Peace, where we want to bring together donors, plus also DFIs and IFIs, to then provide loans for investments, peace-positive investments, in particularly fragile contexts. Again, something that is very new, but we hope that we can get other donors on board, so that and the IFIs and DFIs on board, so that then we can help create long-term prospects for particular regions. So this is just a few examples of what we are trying to do to improve the response, despite the fact that budgets are shrinking in traditional donor settings. Sorry.
Many thanks, Frau Potzel. I mean, on the final point, some might say it's a different story, broadening for fair reasons the donor base versus the narrative on why you engage yourself, and if it's more interest or value driven, some might argue. But Thea, a final word on that one, or whatever you like, and then Olivier, and then we really have to close because we are overrunning already.
Oh, yeah, I don't have the mic anymore. I will have this one. Thanks. My final words. First, I want to pay my respects to humanitarians that are in this room. And I honestly feel that humanitarians, I just admire you so much, you know. And one of the things I like humanitarians, they always find ways to act and they never give up. And that is just amazing. And that is something that I really think we should also say here in this panel, that despite the politicization, you just keep going. And I can't tell you how much I admire that. What I might want to just raise, you said I've been around for too long already, which is true. And I just wanted to, no, not too long, you said very long. Anyway, you said something that made me feel very old, very old. I wanted to say, go back to 911. What happened after that, to my mind, is that quite a lot of the humanitarians, they sort of said something like, let's go back to basics. We cannot be politicized, da, 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 da. We have to do everything for the humanitarian principles and all that, which is understandable. And it's a way of reacting. Just go to your little island of the humanitarians. But it was also killing, to some extent, trends that had been going on. I'm glad you mentioned the nexus, which is now the nexus, which was before different. There was also a huge trend of respecting the role of national actors in providing services to humanitarians. And after post-911, those type of trends were kind of, you know, cut through, because humanitarians started to go back to this idea like we are the only ones owning the principles and understanding the principles. Now, and that is in a way unfortunate. So this is a kind of crossroads coming back to you at this time. And I would somehow think, okay, I can understand when you want to say like, okay, let's just be the humanitarians that do the principles, but find constituencies exactly now. Try to reach out, try to understand that other people too may have principles, other people too, even though everybody is political, but is it like you have the political that is overriding everything else, but you also have the political that is, yes, winding down, but it's still doable type of political, and in which we still can understand and see some visible ideas of the love for humanity. And that's what we are in for. And for this, we really need to build some constituency and to be together in defending international humanitarian law, because I think that's the main theme of this panel. It's not just about where is the money going, but it's do we accept the undermining of international humanitarian law in the way we see it today, in an attack on the whole system of the UN and the system of international humanitarian law and everything that comes with it. And for that, we need to unite with many more than just the humanitarians. Thanks.
Many thanks, Thea. Over to you, Olivier. Maybe you could feed in something charming, like Thea said, and congratulating everybody and praising everybody for the great work. That was very nice.
Thank you. So no, I'll just, maybe it's a bit of a wrap-up, but I think it's more maybe from a human perspective. I think what we've talked about is basically increasing challenging contexts, you know, erosion of the mandate, aid workers under attack. We've talked also about the fact that we need to be better at basically both service delivery but as well advocacy. And I think there, at least my reflection would be just also to invite all the organizations and you know, future humanitarians and existing humanitarians in the room to also not forget basically the human cost and the emotional cost that this is. I think in particular, again, for staff, national staff in particular, civil society organizations who really struggle in many, many contexts to deliver aid, who have many conflicting demands from their organizations, from the donors, from, of course, the conflicting parties. And I think it's to basically also have that space where we can, you know, take a step back, maybe preserve also a little bit, you know, the staff, really putting staff care, support mechanisms, prioritizing that a little bit. Because I'm very worried about the fact that there's not just, you know, increased victims in our sector. It's also that I feel strongly, being in touch with field for many years and a bit less since I'm back in Brussels, but basically feeling that people are exhausted in many contexts. I think we need to collectively reflect on that. We need to collectively get better at responding to this need. Because it's not just that we actually have less hands when colleagues are killed, it's also the fact that the existing staff and capacities need to be really better supported. And I think, yeah, I would just say that again, I think that the system is also really changing. And I welcome actually a lot of the change that is currently ongoing, in particular localization. But I think it's basically inviting that it's not about the institutions and, you know, the logos and which NGO gets what grant. I think we need to put people first, because actually a lot of the colleagues move around in different NGOs, and it's basically people, not institutions, that need to be prioritized, because in particular national staff and national NGOs and CSOs, they are there to stay. They might never talk about post-traumatic stress disorder because they're accumulating stress and trauma. So we need to invest in people, not in institutions. And I think that the global humanitarian landscape is up for shake-up, which I think is very good. We need to rethink the way we work, but we need to really invest in staff care.
Many thanks, Olivier. Point well taken. Sorry for being a bit pushy, because now we need to invest into the lunch of the staff present and the great people around. So in this sense, really only one final word from my side. Many thanks to the panel. Please give a hand to the panel. It's been really an engaged and inspired discussion. I really like that we had an open and frank and controversial discussion, and not in all ways along the regular lines. And I think that's really a lot needed on this topic, but in the sector overall. And so many thanks for that and for having this frank discussion. And for your patience, it's been impressive how long you stayed and how many of you came. Thanks so much and have a great lunch.